and I want to welcome you to Beit Zatoun. I think for perhaps a good many, you might be from Hamilton and it's your first visit. That's a very special welcome. You're probably wondering what is this place that you've landed in. Beit Zatoun is Arabic for House of Olive, and it's an art gallery, a culture center, and a meeting place for the grassroots of Toronto on all issues of social justice, human rights, and liberation struggles. We've been here in this space for going on 7 years, and we've had about 1,001 events by the end. And these have been really from all communities of Toronto on all subjects of justice or injustice, whether it be political, economic, social, extraction, mining, climate change, and such. And Beit Zatoun has really developed into a special place for the activist community. And tonight's event is of particular interest, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. Just to say also that Beit Zatoun is a bit of a time clock here. All of Mirvish Street here is going to be redeveloped next year. So we're closing our doors November 30th and not reopening, just because we've been in this space. It's been an incredible home for us, not to be repeated, unfortunately. But we do have 3 months remaining, September, October, November, and we have every intention to really, go out with a bang, and looking forward to many events, as many as 60 or so events. Typically we do about 10 a month, but we'll be doing around 20 a month, we hope, with a particular focus on Palestine. And Palestine is our original kind of core mandate. The roots of Beit Zatoun are Palestine, but the tree is global justice. And so the idea is to really go back to our roots in those last 3 months. And we'd like to invite you to join us in those 3 months. And also, if you have events or are from organizations, you have topics that you'd like to bring to Beit Zatoun, please just bring them to myself via email, via our website, so we could talk about that and see what's possible. So that's it for Beit Zatoun, really. One last thing is, if you want to join us on our mailing list, it's the best way to learn about our events coming up. Like I said, typically it's about 10 events or so. But you can't compete with summer. So we don't even really try. In May we had about 18 events. In June we had about 9 or 10. And in July, like 2 or 3. And we're closed for the month of August. But we'll be back in September. So they're on the red clipboard on the round table. There is a mailing list sign-up sheet, so please just sign up. And so that brings us to tonight. A very important event, I think. And what's most important about it is the reaction that it has brought on in sectors of Toronto, you could say. And it strikes at the heart of who and what Beit Zatoun wants to be. Beit Zatoun really wants to be and is an open space for respectful, intelligent exploration among adults. And there's been quite a bit of pressure to cancel this event. And of course, there's no way we would cancel an event, certainly not on sort of the pretext of dogma and intolerance to another point of view. That would defeat the entire purpose of Beit Zatoun. That said, it's really incredible how Syria stands on its own as a subject, as a topic, as a reality that divides people. I don't think I've ever seen it in any other area or subject that people discuss. And I think part of it is that we're all kind of blind in terms of what's happening, who's pulling the strings, to what end. It is just such a mystery. And I think anybody who says they know exactly what's happening and who's behind this and that, I really doubt it. So, and it's not about purely knowing the full story, but it's being open to the entire picture and whoever has to present it or contribute to it. And that, I think, is where Beit Zatoun stands out, is in its willingness to host all sides of any particular topic. And I think that's very important. Just to say that this has been categorized as a pro-Assad sort of evening. We have hosted what you would call anti-Assad evenings. And we've hosted them in the same spirit of openness and respect. And in my mind, you can only do an equal treatment for the other side, wherever that happens to be. So I think the people who objected the most on social media are not here tonight. So I don't think we're going to have the kind of conflict that I thought might be happening. So that's okay. I will be moderating the question and answer for this evening after the presentation by Ken. And I look forward to having a respectful, intelligent exploration and meaningful questions of Ken and his experience. So Ken Stone, I don't know Ken Stone. This is the first time I've met him. Second time? When was the first time? Oh, okay. Well, did you introduce yourself? I'm sorry. Okay.
You know him.
I know him. Okay. Well, I didn't know him as Ken Stone today, and I think that's the difference. But all I've heard are good things. And I also have huge respect for you as a long-term activist, a lifelong activist who's really paid a price. Because many activists have not paid the price. They like to talk, they like to, do the polemics, and especially in university types. Shouldn't say that. But, and they're very comfortable. And activism is not about comfort. And so, huge respect to you for doing what you have done all these many, many years. So welcome to Beit Zatoun and welcome to this evening. Thank you.
If I may for a minute. I'm going to be taking photographs with Ken over the evening. Is there anybody who has a problem with having their picture taken?
No problem if you're not taking pictures.
Okay. I always like that.
Greetings, brothers and sisters. I'd like to thank Robert for hosting this event, and I'm going to ask right now for a big round of applause for resisting the pressure to cancel what is, in fact, a pro-Assad presentation. My presentation lasts about 50 minutes, I think, and I'm going to start with the big picture. In October 2011, General Wesley Clark reported for active duty at the Pentagon. This was following 9/11, and when he arrived, he was told by his colleagues that the U.S. was going to take down 7 countries in 5 years. Here's the hit list. Only one of these countries has not yet been militarily hit. I raise this point because I want to counter the propaganda we get in the mainstream media and by governments in the West that the conflict in Syria is a civil war. It is not a civil war. It has been planned for a long time as a regime change operation by the United States of America. It is an illegal war of aggression against a sovereign country. And because it's an illegal war of aggression against the sovereign country of Syria, the government of Syria has the right under international law and the legal obligation to use whatever force is necessary to end the aggression, to repel the aggressors, and to safeguard its citizens and its infrastructure. Now, Ramsey Clark was in Washington because of George Bush's war on terror. The war on terror is not really a war on terror. In my opinion, it's a war of terror against the mainly Muslim and Arab peoples of Central Asia, Central and West Asia. It's characterized by the permanent war. That's something that the military-industrial complex, first described by President Eisenhower, need in order to be able to bilk the American taxpayers of about $800 billion per year in armaments. It's characterized by Islamophobia worldwide and racial profiling here in North America and Europe. It's characterized by a campaign of disinformation. At the beginning of the War on Terror, they told us that they were going to have a campaign of disinformation. That means lies and deceit and propaganda. So we shouldn't be surprised if we are faced with that every day in the media. Lies, deception, every day. And it's characterized by a complete disrespect for international law. Bush said he was going to go after the terrorists wherever they were. So there's no recognition of national sovereignty, which is the basis of international law. They were the great powers of the West, and basically NATO powers, were going to intervene militarily wherever they felt like. And they were going to ignore international law as well about the questions of torture and rendition. We had, since 1989, with the fall of the Soviet Union, a unipolar world in which the United States was the only superpower. And in this period of the 25 years, the United States has sought permanent U.S. global hegemony. That's a political science term. What it means in simple English is world domination. They wanted to prevent the rise of rival states. They needed to control global energy resources. That doesn't mean that the United States didn't have enough oil for itself. It meant that it wanted to have its hand on the taps in all the countries where oil and natural gas is produced, so as to be able to decide who gets it and who doesn't get it. Also, you can make a lot of money by having your hand on the tap. So by controlling the flow of oil and natural gas around the world, you control the economies of the world, you control the world. The U.S. unipolar world used its military interventions, such as in Afghanistan, and its military bases to encircle its potential rivals, such as Russia, China, and Iran. And NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, a legacy of Lester B. Pearson, his great legacy. He said himself, it was not Medicare, it was not UN peacekeeping, it was NATO, the Western military alliance to defend the West against communism, Soviet communism. Well, when Soviet communism ended at the end of the 1980s, NATO should have been disbanded. The Warsaw Pact was disbanded, but NATO instead became the military arm and the hitmen for the United States and NATO in the 25 years since the end of the Cold War. And finally, on the economic front, globalization became the means to reduce the power of nation states to have any control over their own economies in the face of transnational corporations. Globalization has made what we call, made the phenomena of the 1%, the super rich, while at the same time impoverishing working people and destroying their social programs and privatizing their social resources. So these are the interventions that the U.S. unipolar world has engaged in the last 25 years since the end of the Soviet Union. I'm not going to talk about them all. If someone would like to ask me a question about 2003 Iraq and the recent Chilcot report under the Q&A, I'd love to talk about that. I'm going to note tonight, concerning 2006 Lebanon, that tonight is the 10th anniversary of the Israeli attack on Lebanon, in which a handful of brave fighters of Hezbollah, armed with Iranian missiles, turned back an Israeli ground attack, an illegal attack on Lebanon, and as the Israeli correspondents wrote, turned the Israeli tanks into flaming coffins. And the Israeli attack was turned back, but that didn't stop them, of course, from taking revenge on Lebanon by carpet bombing whole sections of South Lebanon, destroying whole villages, a lot of infrastructure, and killing a lot of people. And all this was happening while Benjamin Netanyahu was on a state visit to his best friend in the world, Stephen Harper. You might remember that. An interesting fact about the U.S. interventions in the unipolar world is not only was it not a war on terrorism, they actually used terrorism, created terrorists. For example, in Afghanistan, the United States created the Taliban. It created Al-Qaeda. In Serbia, during 1999, the fight over Kosovo, they used the West, NATO, in a completely illegal operation, bombing Serbia for 78 days without the approval of the United Nations Security Council, used these thugs, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was a gang of drug smugglers and human traffickers, and NATO became the air force for these thugs. And now, of course, in Syria, we have the ISIS, Daesh head choppers, who are, in my opinion, the boots on the ground, an asset of the West, along with the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria known as al-Nusra, and several dozens of other military groups armed and paid for by the West and the Arab monarchies. How does they get away with this, you may ask? How does they get away with this marketing, this neo-colonial aggression in the West? And the answer is the white man's burden. It's turned in, what you do is you turn your aggression into a mission. You become missionaries. And so in this picture, John Bull, representing Britain, is carrying on his back the Chinese, the Arabs, the Indians, the Africans, etc., over a bunch of stumbling blocks to glorious European civilization at the top of the mountain. And unfortunately in the West, we have so-called leftists who, despite the fact that we have one of these interventions every few years, they always seem to end up supporting these interventions. And if it can be sold as a humanitarian intervention, it's that much easier to get support in the West. If you look at the picture there at the top, that's the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. It is largely responsible for the newest form of humanitarian intervention known as R2P, Responsibility to Protect, developed right here in Toronto. Our former Prime Minister, Paul Martin, Liberal, took that doctrine to the United Nations, I think it was 2001, and he tried to sell it there, and in fact, in 2005, it was adopted at the UN World Summit Conference. I think that was, I'm not sure if it was New York. In red, it says, we are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council in accordance with the Charter, on a case-by-case basis and in cooperation with the relevant regional organizations as appropriate, should peaceful means be inadequate and national authorities manifestly fail to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. That is the new doctrine that has been adopted by the UN, and the first time it was used was in Libya, 2011. UN Resolution 1978, the NATO no-fly zone, which, unfortunately, the Russians and Chinese did not use their veto to stop, and the result was that NATO, including your own, CF-18s funded out of your pockets, were used to bomb Libya into submission, into regime change. This might have been the result of a Canadian plane. And so NATO abused this process in Libya, and it turned Libya into what is now a failed state. In the year 2000, Bashar al-Assad came to power, and a reform movement blossomed in Syria. At that time, and he became identified with the reform movement, actually. At that time, the United States made several approaches to Bashar and to the government, the coalition of the government coalition, and they said to him, you know, if you come to our side, we can get you back the Golan Heights. All you have to do is give up your friends from Iran, and who have given you much support over 20 years, including military help. You have to give up your Lebanese allies in Hezbollah and more or less turn a blind eye to any Israeli intentions to take Lebanon. You need to make peace with Israel. You need to get rid of that Russian military base in Tartus and break off the alliance with them. You need to betray the Palestinians, kick their leaders in the PLO and Hamas out of Damascus, tell them to go find some other place. And you need to give up, renounce your support for the Palestinian struggle. You need to forget about pan-Arabism and uniting the whole Arab nation against imperialism. And you need to forget about your social programs and all that social rhetoric that's part of the Ba'ath Party. And after some consideration, the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad said no, no thank you. And they came to be part of what's known as the resistance front against Zionism and imperialism, which includes the Iranians, Hezbollah, and Syria. And at the end of the war against Lebanon, which started, as I said, 10 years ago tonight, there was a poll taken by an American polling firm, or a Western polling firm, throughout the Middle East. And they asked who were the most popular Arab politicians. And without even by far, there was no competition. The two most popular politicians from Baghdad to Algiers were Bashar al-Assad and Nasrallah. And it was at that point that the Americans decided they needed to start an operation for regime change in Syria. 2006. What is my evidence? My evidence is the article by Seymour Hersh, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, in the New Yorker in 2007 called The Redirection, in which he described how American policy had now changed, and the policy was going to be, they were adopting some ideas from Israeli documents, from US military documents. They were going to redraw the map of the Middle East. They were going to break up the countries that were created under the Sykes-Picot Treaty at the end of World War I, and they were going to divide these countries along confessional and ethnic lines, along religion and along ethnicity, and have a bunch of balkanized little states, all hostile to each other, all armed to the teeth, because the Americans would sell arms to all sides, and the Americans would be better, Americans and NATO would be better able to divide and rule over a bunch of little states rather than the states that exist now. So sectarianism was the tool by which the Americans decided by which they were going to redraw the map of the Middle East. The other person who is my reference here is Julian Assange and his WikiLeaks. There are the cables from the US Embassy starting in July 2006 indicate that the American government was committed to regime change, and the embassy in Damascus was charged with facilitating that, starting that regime change. 2011, there was a spontaneous uprising, or spontaneous discontent, manifestations of discontent across the Middle East, and it came to Syria as well. But it's not the way it's portrayed in the West. I'm going to read you a paragraph from my booklet, Defiant Syria. Father Frans van der Lugt, a Dutch Jesuit, remained in Homs during its control by the foreign-backed mercenaries. Interestingly, he had noted in his journals that there was an armed and violent contingent in the protests in Homs right from the start of the crisis in 2011, and that the rebel forces committed many atrocities and then blamed them on the Syrian government. He ministered peacefully to his congregation, focusing on persons with disabilities, until on April 7, 2014, al-Nusra terrorists came to the garden of the Jesuit monastery and ordered him to leave Homs. When he refused to abandon his flock, they cowardly gunned him down in cold blood at the age of 76. His tomb in the form of a cross is laid in that very garden. Father Franz was the second foreign Jesuit martyred in Syria. So what he is saying, which has been reflected by a number of people on the ground, is that right from the very start There were armed militants in the demonstrations who were targeting and shooting and killing Syrian soldiers and police in order to provoke a reaction. The Americans thought that Assad would fall in a matter of weeks. Here's an article from the Atlantic Monthly by Elliot Abrams, former National Security Advisor to George Bush, and it says, "How will Syria's Assad fall?" Well, it didn't fall in a few weeks. So, U.S. Ambassador Robert Ford, a war criminal in his own respect, the architect of the death squads in Honduras and the death squads in Iraq, got into his car without permission, left Damascus and drove down to Hama and then to Aleppo, and of course he was later forced out by the Syrian government, but he went there to show American support for the demonstrations and to egg the people on in a clear violation of diplomatic immunity. When the Syrian government did not fall, the West realized that something more concerted had to be done. And so they created the Friends of Syria group of countries, the founding conference of which was in Tunis in February 2012. And just look who's in the front row of the conference. Do you recognize her?
Yeah. Hillary.
Yes, the Queen of Chaos, the Wicked Witch of the West, in the very front row of the Friends of Syria group of people. And this group, at this meeting, they made a division of labor. The Saudis and the Qataris with very deep pockets were going to finance the operation and also recruit from their jails and from other places, their madrasas, psychopaths and anybody who's willing to do the dirty work of looting, raping, killing, pillaging. And the Western countries, France, United States, Britain, committed to training, arming, and coordinating the rebel groups inside the neighboring countries of Syria, Jordan and Turkey mainly. I'm ashamed to say that the Harper government of Canada helped to organize this conference. And later, in June 2013, the Canadian government under Harper chaired in Ottawa, at your expense, the economic sanctions subcommittee of the Friends of Syria group, which laid illegal sanctions, severe sanctions against Syria that made life so miserable that many Syrians were forced to flee the country and become refugees. The Harper government, as part of the division of labor at this conference, committed to looking after the humanitarian needs of the refugees by looking after them helping to support them in the camps. It allocated $600 million and to repatriate some to Canada. But as you know, the Harper government had no intention of bringing any significant number to Canada and dragged their feet for years until finally poor Aylan Kurdi washed up on a beach in Turkey. Just to do his little part, U.S. Senator John McCain was in Syria illegally, and he met with moderate Syrian rebels, some of whom later ended up kidnapping Shia pilgrims and joining ISIS. These were moderate Syrian rebels. So, for 5.5 years, the Syrian people, there's been a dirty war waged on Syria and the Syrian people. This is an excellent book by Professor Tim Anderson. It's an e-book. You can buy it for $9 online. And it describes in great detail how the international media governments conspired to bring down the Syrian government. And so for 5.5 years, we have had nearly 500,000 deaths. We have 11 million displaced people, including 3 or 4 million refugees. We have the economy in ruins in Syria, huge unemployment, spiraling prices, devaluation of the pound, infrastructure destroyed, the industrial base of the country in Aleppo looted by the mercenaries and carted back to Turkey. We have had terrible war crimes committed by these moderate Syrian rebels. including execution of Syrian army prisoners in violation of the Geneva Convention, extra-legal assassination of people in the street in front of their own families who are of a different religion or a different sect or a different political belief than the mercenaries. And the mercenaries have the audacity not only to do these things, but they videotape it and put all these videotapes on YouTube. So how has Syria survived? These are all the other victims of the unipolar world we lived in for the last 25 years. I'm not going to go over these. You probably know them very well. One reason that the Syrian government survived was a legacy of the French Revolution, which took place on this day, on this evening, 227 years ago. One of the gifts of the French Revolution, other than destroying the feudal, beginning the end of the feudal system, was the separation of church and state, which results in, it used to be that there was a king and there was an official religion, an official church. And if you didn't belong to the official church, you didn't get any privileges. You were discriminated against. The French Revolution initiated what's common now today in most countries of the world called the secular state. And Syria is a diverse and pluralist society. This is just a little list from Wikipedia of the ethnic groups in Syria and the religious groups. And these groups, almost all, look to the Syrian government as their protector, because without the protection of a secular government, the country would fall into ruin and chaos. And this, of course, is what the terrorist mercenaries are up to, the sectarianism. Most countries in the world are secular countries. Canada is a secular country. We don't have an official religion in Canada. The Canadian government is committed by the Constitution Act to protect the freedom of religion of every minority religion. And we have laws to protect the ethnic rights of all different ethnic groups. In fact, we promote that. We call it multiculturalism. We're proud of it. And they do the same. They have a history in Syria of being a pluralist and diverse society in which the secular government protects the rights of all. There are other countries who are not secular countries. I can think of two offhand. One is Saudi Arabia, where not even a church or a synagogue is allowed to be built. And where the Shia minority is persecuted every day. And some of their leaders were recently beheaded, including Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. Another state that's not a secular state is the Zionist state of Israel, which is, quote, a Jewish state. But unfortunately, it has nothing to do with Judaism. It calls itself a Jewish state and discriminates against the Palestinian people. So Syria is a state like Canada. It's a secular state, and that's one of the reasons the people of Syria support the government. Now, it has other strong national institutions, such as the army. This is the Syrian Arab Army. On June the 4th, at the boundaries of Raqqa province. I'm pleased to report that as of today, they are now 20 kilometers from Raqqa.